and welcome to episode 57 of the CRICKETher Vodcast, and welcome to our office today. We're at Reading Cricket Club, where Berkshire are playing Exeter University, and we've got lots of cricket to talk about and a little bit of cricket to watch. Raph, we had a little bit of feedback after last week's podcast, didn't we? And some suggestion that we were perhaps anti-Australian. Are we?
I wouldn't say that we are, but obviously to some people, they may have that opinion, and that's absolutely fine. One of the reasons for doing the podcast is, of course, to get some debate going about these issues, and I'd like to think that that's what we're trying to do, rather than be on any one side in particular. We had a great time in Australia last year for the T20 World Cup. We loved it. We have a lot of Australian friends, and I think that it's perhaps, we are England supporters at the end of the day, but hopefully it's more of a friendly rivalry than us being anti-Australian. So I think that's my feeling. And we did also have a few comments coming in from Australians saying that they thought that they found the podcast really interesting, and that it was actually really kind of helpful and interesting to get a bit of a different perspective that wasn't a purely kind of sort of congratulatory perspective, if I might put it like that. So hopefully what we're doing is trying to move the debate on rather than being negative.
Okay, well, talking of Australia, there was a little book published this week. Well, not a little book, quite a thick book, called Wisden. And Raph, you wrote a piece for Wisden, which is also available online. Raph, what did you write about and why?
Well, yeah, it was about an Australian player who was named as the leading women cricketer in the year for 2020, and that was Beth Mooney. As ever, I was really pleased to be able to, or to be asked to write that piece and then to be able to have it published. And it was great to interview Beth, which actually happened in early January, so we were in the deep midwinter. And because of the way that the time difference was working with Australia, and obviously Beth Mooney is a busy person, and I didn't want to inconvenience her, so it was quite early in our UK morning, and she had we were doing the interview over Zoom, because that's just the easiest way to record an interview at the moment, and bless her, she had put on the full green and gold kit because she thought that it might be a video interview, and I was in a onesie because I'd just got out of bed. So there's a little bit of a contrast there, and I felt slightly unprofessional, but I did apologise, and I said, I'm sorry, Beth, that you got the wrong end of the stick there. It's actually just the audio that we needed, but thank you so much for putting on the full regalia for me and for Wisden. And she was just absolutely brilliant, a joy to interview, just very honest, and I think that in a couple of the documentaries that we've seen subsequent to that interview, other people have seen that she is honest, and that's really refreshing when somebody actually says what they're really thinking, and they talk about things like the time that they were vomiting at the side of the cricket pitch during a big bash match because they were trying so hard and it was a very hot day and things like that. So that's lovely when you actually get somebody who's prepared to speak very openly and honestly, and of course she's a very humble person as well, and she was actually, I think, a little bit embarrassed by this honour, but she shouldn't be, because she's a brilliant player. She had a great year in 2020, and thoroughly deserved. Now, another bit of the debate this week surrounding Wisden, Sid, has been the fact that, of course, we did have a leading female cricketer of the year, as we always do, or have had since 2015. However, for the first time in a few years, there was no woman named as one of the 5 cricketers of the year. And I think you were a little bit disappointed. There was maybe some disappointment generally being expressed on social media about that. So, what have you got to say, Sid?
Yeah, I felt it was a little bit disappointing. I guess disappointing is probably the right word there. I'm not angry about this, and I think that Lawrence Booth, the editor of Wisden, is a great guy. He's a great writer, and he's done so much to actually be positive about women's cricket. Yeah. And I think there's always going to be a case for this player or that player, and it's a difficult balance to strike. But I was a little bit disappointed. For me, I think that Georgia Adams did enough. She had an absolutely outstanding season, and it feels like nobody quite dominated a domestic season for a long time. I've watched the last 10 or so County Championships pretty closely, and it feels like maybe Susie Bates in the final season she played at Kent was very dominant that year, but I still don't feel that she, even in that year, as a domestic performance, was quite achieved the level above everyone else that Georgia Adams did, and she certainly made a huge impact. And she led from the front. And if you take away everything that Georgia Adams does, I don't think that Vipers win the Rachel Hayo Flint at that point. But Lawrence made his decision, and it's cool, and we'll take things forward next year, and we'll see where we go next year. But hopefully we'll be in a position next year with a lot more domestic cricket being played for a woman to be on that list next year.
Okay, so 5 cricketers of the year. Should there be a separate list for men? Because that was one of the questions being asked, wasn't it?
Yeah, for me, that's the answer is no there. I think that I'd like to see one list. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a separate list for men and women, what you'll do is you'll wind up, I think you yourself pointed this out on Twitter, that you wind up with 10 people on the list and then the women just get drowned out anyway. I think 5 is the right number. And, I think that we should be looking to make sure that women are included in that list, going forwards. Not as tokens, but as the fact that the women's game is important, and the women's game should be seen to have parity with the men's game.
Yeah, I think my feeling is that there's always going to be accusations of tokenism because cricket supporters are notoriously conservative, and I think I kind of pointed this out on Twitter in an interesting conversation with Lawrence himself. And he did have a lot of criticism in 2018 when he named 3 women out of the 5 in the list. People saying, "Oh, you're just being tokenistic." So that is always going to happen. If that's going to happen anyway, then you may as well have it that there is a kind of almost like a quota of having 2 women and 2 men, and then 1 5th spot up for grabs. That was my preferred option. Anyway, be really interesting, as you say, to see what happens next year, given that we've got a proper full schedule of fixtures this summer. So that nicely segues into our next talking point, which is that we have finally now got a confirmed list of international fixtures for this summer, and England are going to be rather busy. They're going to be playing, obviously the big news is this test against India that's going to kickstart the season at Bristol in June. They're then going to be playing 3 ODIs and 3 T20s against India, and then New Zealand will be coming in September to play in 5 ODIs and 3 T20s. So there's an awful lot of cricket going to be happening, Sid. However, there's been a little bit of a concern about those early fixtures, given that coronavirus unfortunately seems to be sort of rather taking over a little bit in India at the moment, and maybe some worries about quarantining, and will India, for example, be put on a red list and unable to travel to the UK? So what's the situation?
Okay, well, obviously there are concerns in India at the moment. There's a new variant in India which people are worried about, and there are certainly calls in this country for India to be put on the red list. My understanding, having looked at the laws this morning, is that as things currently stand with India not on the red list, that elite athletes can pretty much just come and go. They're required to take a lot of COVID tests, like, after 2 days, after 8 days, they're required to keep testing every few days in order to do that. In the same way as actually a lot of, all the school kids are, my son at school is having to test a couple of times a week as well. So there's nothing unusual about that. If India were to get put on the red list, that changes things a little bit, and that they do have to do a full hotel quarantine, an approved quarantine hotel. But it should still be possible for the tour to go ahead, I would think. So, that's the situation. And fingers crossed, more fingers crossed for everyone in India that they can start to get things under control in India, because it's obviously quite bad what's happening there at the moment. And so, well, as Raph just mentioned, we're playing a test. So it's the first non-Ashes test since 2014, is that right, Raph? Which is many years ago. And what does that really mean for the game and for the future of Test cricket? Because that's something you've been campaigning for, Raph.
Yeah, I've been trying hard without a huge amount of success. I think in the short term it's obviously brilliant. Test cricket is a format that all the players want to be playing, and that really all the fans want to be watching, and we saw that when this test was announced. People were really, really genuinely excited about it, and the players are as well. So that's fantastic. As you say, the fact that it's a non-Ashes test is really significant, the first one in a number of years, and the fact that India and the BCCI seem to now be wanting to participate in women's Test cricket is obviously significant. I mean, they to some extent control a lot of the purse strings in international cricket, so that's brilliant. Obviously, as well, from an English perspective, and at the risk of sounding a bit anti-Australian here, which I don't mean it to at all, there's a bit of an opportunity perhaps to get one up on Australia ahead of the Women's Ashes, which is going to be taking place in a few months' time. Normally what happens is that neither side has played a test since the previous Ashes test a couple of years ago, but in this instance England will have much more practice of multi-day cricket much more recently from the Ashes. So I think it could potentially be significant, because obviously there's lots of points at stake for doing well in the test as part of the multi-format Ashes. Unfortunately, for kind of the longer term future of women's test cricket, it's difficult to assess how significant this is as far as it just going beyond a single test. The ECB are trying to badge this as a multi-format series, but as far as I can see at the moment, there is no there's nothing confirmed, and there's no indication that the 3 different formats are going to be played for points cumulatively, as is obviously the case with the Women's Ashes. So from that perspective, it's potentially just a kind of one-off match that doesn't. It's obviously really meaningful and significant for the people who play in it, but in terms of the future of the format, if the BCCI had agreed that all future England-India encounters, bilateral encounters, were going to be played for points across the 3 formats, then brilliant, because you say, okay, then we've got multiple tests coming up against India in the future, and England then might get to play a test in India, which would be fantastic and hasn't happened for a long time. So that would be great. That doesn't seem to have happened yet. There was some indication from an ECB employee on Twitter, if you dug very deep into conversations, that potentially that might change before June, but given that it wasn't announced at the same time as the fixtures, my feeling is that the BCCI are actually a bit reluctant to go down that route, because they recognise that it would set a precedent, and that's unfortunate for those of us who care very deeply and want there to be more women's tests. Now, one of the other talking points around the international fixture list, Sid, was the fact that, a few points in relation to the venue list. No match at Lord's for England women this summer. Once again, haven't played there since the 2017 World Cup final. No matches in London, although contrarily, lots of people in the north complaining that there are no matches in the north. I think the furthest north they're going is it Derby, which isn't actually that far north if you live in the north. So is that a bit of a concern, Sid? And do we think that England should be playing at the bigger test venues, which would obviously then open up places like Headingley and Old Trafford?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. I feel we should perhaps apologise to people in Derby. I had a friend at university from Derby, and if anyone told her she was from the north, she would give them a stare that took them several days to recover from. So.
Oh no, are we going to get accused of being anti-north now?
Look, I think that it's ultimately, as Heather Knight actually said on the press conference, she made a really important point here. She said that this is driven by the size of the grounds. These are the right size grounds for England to be playing in at the moment. And she was asked at the press conference. They made a comparison with the fact that Australia are playing at the MCG, and Heather was like, "Well, they filled the MCG once," and then she was like, "If they played at the MCG every week, they'd get no crowds at all."
I thought that was really
a bit of a
funny.
sick burn from Heather, as the kids say, but it was true. And so, and it is a pity that we don't have a smaller ground in London, really. We've got no equivalent of like the Bankstown Oval or North Sydney Oval. So, it does make it difficult, because, if you're going to be in London, your only option is Lord's or the Oval, which are both huge grounds, which are really expensive to open, and at the end of the day don't look great, even if you've got 5,000 people in them. So, going for those grounds with that sort of 5,000 capacity, I think is the right decision for the administrators to be making. And at the end of the day, most of them are, in the Midlands, in the middle of the country, but, that's reasonably kind of accessible to most people. So, I think the authorities are doing their best with the grounds that are available to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something maybe slightly different about Lords in the sense of it being the home of cricket and there being a symbolic importance attached to that. So my personal view is that actually, yes, they should be playing at Lords a bit more often. It would be great to see, say, one England women's match at Lords every summer. But other than that, I thought that Heather made a really good point, which was basically what we need to be aiming at in the short and medium term is selling out every ground that we play at, so these medium-sized grounds or the smaller grounds, and then we can then think about kind of bumping ourselves up and filling out test grounds, which obviously is the aim, and she didn't deny that that's the ultimate aim, but in the short term I kind of agree with you that the venues that we're playing in are the best ones at the moment.
At the end of the day, what drives the revenue in cricket, all of cricket, not just women's cricket but men's cricket as well, is television revenue. So what you've got to be thinking about is what looks good on television, and what looks good on television is a full ground. If that's a 5,000 ground that's full, then that looks better than a 30,000 ground that's well over half empty. Finally this week, Raph, you tweeted yesterday and got like 500 likes for a tweet to say that you finished writing your book, which is great news, but hang on. I thought you'd already written a book. I'm sure you wrote a book last year. You did, of course, write a book last year, which has been Raf's book from last year. The old book has been nominated for the shortlist of the Cricket Society MCC Book of the Year, which was fantastic news and a very good choice by them, I have to say, in my unbiased opinion. But Raph, you've written another book this year, so your second book in 2 years. If you keep going at this rate, you'll knock up your century before we know it. Raph, what's different about this new book that you've written?
Yeah, so the new book is it's going to be much more of a popular book. And by that I mean it's going to be kind of priced in a way that's a little bit more accessible, and it's also written in a way that is kind of less academic. So the existing book, or the old book as you're now referring to it as, it was much more an academic text that was kind of trying to contextualise stuff that happened and talk about why it happened, and there's lots and lots of footnotes and references, etc, etc. So maybe not the most accessible book. This new book, the one that I've just finished, which is very exciting, is going to be much more just a kind of straightforward storytelling about what happened, in what order. There's going to be a lot more cricket in it actually, which is kind of a funny thing to say when I say that the old book doesn't have an awful lot of cricket in, but by that I mean that because it was much more about the kind of academic context, there wasn't a huge amount of kind of so and so hit a century here or so and so took a five for, etc. Whereas this new book does have a lot more of that. So there's a lot more cricket, a lot more kind of action, and I feel like I've really poured quite a lot of the research that I did for the PhD into this one that kind of didn't make it into the old book just because it had a different purpose. So yeah, I'm really excited. The idea is that it goes through all the copy editing and all of those processes over the next few months, and then it's actually available at the back end of the season, if that's not too ambitious a target for people to buy. So there were some people talking about being able to buy it as Christmas presents. That should be very possible, especially if you're very organised with your Christmas lists.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait to see what's in my Christmas stocking this year. Here's a copy of my book, Sid.
I'll sign it for you.
Oh wow, okay, well that makes all the difference. Anyway, well, thanks very much for tuning in this week. We'll leave you with that, and we're going to turn around now and watch a little bit of cricket, which is lovely to do on a beautiful day, and we will see you same time, probably not the same place, next week.